Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to an in-depth exploration of one of the most fascinating economic stories of our time, the rise of India as a potential global superpower. Today we are diving into the incredible journey of India's economy, a nation that's not only home to one of the largest populations on the planet, but also, since 2014, the fastest growing major economy in the world. This is a story of resilience, transformation, and untapped potential. A story that begins centuries ago under colonial rule and stretches into a future where India could rival giants like China and the United States. So, settle in, because we're going to unpack how India got here, where it's headed, and why it matters to the world. Let's start with the big picture. India is a nation of over 1.3 billion people, soon to surpass China as the world's most populous country. Its economy, while still smaller than that of California in GDP terms, has been growing at an astonishing pace. Over the past 2 decades, India has lifted hundreds of millions of its citizens out of poverty, an achievement that's nothing short of remarkable. But to understand where India is going, we need to first look back at where it's been. India's economic story is one of overcoming immense challenges, from colonial exploitation to bureaucratic hurdles, and emerging as a global contender. Let's take a step back in time to set the stage. Picture this, it's the early 20th century and India is under British colonial rule. For over a century, the British East India Company and later the British Crown controlled vast swathes of the subcontinent, extracting resources like cotton, tea and spices to fuel the Industrial Revolution back in Europe. India was often referred to as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, not because it was prosperous for its people, but because it was a gold mine for colonial powers. The economic policies of the British were designed to maximize extraction, not development. Railways were built, but primarily to transport goods to ports for export. Industries were stifled to prevent competition with British manufacturers. As historian B.R. Tomlinson notes in The Political Economy of the Raj, this era saw India's economy subordinated to colonial interests, with little regard for local welfare. By the time India gained independence in August 1947, it was a nation scarred by exploitation but brimming with potential. Independence was a moment of triumph, but it also posed a daunting question. How do you build a modern economy for a population of over 300 million, most of whom were engaged in subsistence agriculture? Many newly independent nations struggled economically after colonial rule, as the infrastructure left behind was often designed for extraction, not self-sufficiency. But India was different. It had learned hard lessons from its colonial past and was determined to chart its own course. In the years following independence, India's leaders, under the guidance of figures like Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, adopted a protectionist economic model. Protectionism, for those unfamiliar, is when a country prioritizes its own goods and industries over foreign imports, often through tariffs, quotas, or restrictive policies. Now, every nation practices some level of protectionism. Think of tariffs on imported cars or restrictions on foreign steel. But India took this to another level. Why? Because India had seen firsthand what global trade could mean for a nation at the bottom of the industrial ladder. Colonialism had left India wary of opening its markets to foreign powers, fearing a repeat of exploitation. To achieve economic self-reliance, India implemented a series of 5-year plans, inspired partly by Soviet-style central planning. These plans outlined ambitious goals for industrial development, infrastructure, and agriculture. Now, if you're thinking, wait, that sounds a bit like communism, you're not entirely wrong. India did borrow elements of central planning, but it wasn't a communist state. You could still open a restaurant, start a business, or climb the corporate ladder, provided you navigated a labyrinth of bureaucracy known as the License Raj. The License Raj was essentially a massive rulebook that governed nearly every aspect of economic activity. Want to start a factory? You needed a license. Want to import machinery? Another license. Want to expand your business? You guessed it, more paperwork. As described by economists Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen in India, Economic Development and Social Opportunity, this system, while well-intentioned, stifled innovation and entrepreneurship. To give you a sense of how restrictive this was, imagine trying to open a small coffee shop today, but needing government approval for every coffee bean, every chair, and every barista you hire. The License Raj was meant to protect India's economy, but it often slowed progress to a crawl. By the 1950s, India had also nationalized many of its major industries: steel, coal, banking, you name it. The government was in the driver's seat and private enterprise, while not banned, was heavily regulated. India's biggest trading partner during this period, the Soviet Union. In 1971, the two nations signed the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, formalizing a relationship that had been growing for decades. India wasn't aligning itself with communism per se, but it was leaning heavily on Soviet trade and industrial support. This economic model had mixed results. On one hand, India made strides in building a domestic industrial base. Steel plants, dams, and power stations sprang up, laying the foundation for future growth. On the other hand, the economy grew slowly, in line with other centrally planned economies. Over half the population remained in agriculture, and poverty was a persistent challenge. As noted in Modern South Asia by Sugata Bose and Aisha Jalal, India's focus on self-reliance came at the cost of efficiency and global competitiveness. The country was stable, but it wasn't thriving. That is, until everything changed in 1991. Let's fast forward to the early 1990s. India was at a crossroads. The Soviet Union, India's primary trading partner, collapsed in 1991, leaving India without a major source of trade and industrial support. At the same time, global oil prices spiked, hitting India hard because its growing economy relied heavily on imported oil. To make matters worse, India was carrying a heavy debt burden from years of borrowing to fund its development projects. By 1991, the country faced the very real possibility of defaulting on its loans, a scenario that could have crippled its economy. As Robert Casson describes in India, population, economy, society, this was a moment of crisis that demanded bold action. In a last-ditch effort to avoid collapse, India turned to the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, for a $1.8 billion bailout loan. Now, the IMF isn't a charity. It's an international organization with 189 member countries that promotes global trade and economic stability. Think of it as a global financial lifeguard, funded by member states like the USA, which benefits from fostering open markets and sustainable growth. But the IMF doesn't hand out money for free. In exchange for the loan, India had to agree to a set of conditions: deregulate its economy, open up to international trade, and loosen the grip of the license Raj. This was a tough pill to swallow for a nation that had spent decades shielding itself from global markets. But swallow it they did, and the results were transformative. Under the leadership of then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, India embarked on a bold period of economic liberalization. State-run industries were privatized, trade barriers were lowered, and the license Raj, that bureaucratic behemoth, was, as the video puts it, thrown into the wood chipper. Imagine taking a 500-page rulebook and shredding it to make way for innovation and entrepreneurship. The reforms weren't just about cutting red tape, they were about embracing free enterprise and inviting the world to do business with India. The impact of these reforms was nothing short of an economic explosion. Since 1991, India's economy has doubled in size roughly every 5 years, a growth rate that's only been matched by economic giants like China and Japan during their peak industrialization periods. According to the World Economic Outlook database from the IMF, by late 2019, India had become the 5th largest economy in the world, despite still having over half its population employed in agriculture. To put that in perspective, India achieved this ranking while much of its workforce was still plowing fields, not coding software or building factories. That's a testament to the sheer scale of its population and the potential waiting to be unlocked. So, what's driving this growth? Let's break it down. First, India's industrialization has been accelerated by the lessons of history. Back in the 1760s, when England kicked off the first industrial revolution, factories had to figure everything out from scratch: how to design assembly lines, how to optimize factory layouts, even how to make a decent bolt. It took decades to go from steam-powered looms to a fully industrialized nation. Fast forward to the 20th century, and countries like China and Thailand went from agricultural to industrial economies in a fraction of the time. 20 years for China, 5 for Thailand. Why? Because they didn't have to reinvent the wheel. Modern nations can buy advanced machinery, adopt proven industrial practices, and hit the ground running. India is no exception. As noted by Philip Griffiths in The British Impact on India, access to global technology has allowed India to leapfrog stages of industrial development. Second, the world is now a deeply interconnected global economy. When a country shows promise, multinational corporations flock to it, bringing investment, expertise, and jobs. India's low labor costs make it an attractive destination for companies looking to manufacture goods or provide services. Think about the call centers you've probably heard about, or maybe even called. India has become the world's hub for service call centers, an industry worth tens of billions of dollars. This isn't just a stereotype, it's a major economic driver, providing good-paying jobs to millions of English-speaking Indians. Speaking of English, let's talk about one of India's biggest advantages, its language. India is home to the second largest English-speaking population in the world, behind only the United States. Now, I know this might stir some debate, but English is the lingua franca of international trade and business. About 10% of India's population speaks English compared to less than 1% in China. This makes it easier for global companies to set up shop in India, communicate with local workers, and integrate into the global market. It's no coincidence that India has cornered markets like call centers and IT services, where clear communication is key. Another major advantage is India's legal system. As a former British colony, India inherited a legal framework rooted in Western democratic principles. It has a president as head of state, a bicameral legislature with an upper and lower house, and a ranked court system. To a multinational corporation, this is a big deal. Businesses want to know that trade disputes will be settled fairly, contracts will be honored, and intellectual property will be protected. Compared to countries like China, where legal systems can be less predictable for foreign companies, India offers a familiar and relatively reliable environment. Now let's be clear, India's legal system isn't perfect. Corruption is a challenge, as noted by Myron Weiner in State Politics in India. But for global businesses, corruption is often a manageable hurdle as long as the core legal framework is solid. India's massive population, over 1.3 billion and counting, is another asset. Combine that with favorable environmental conditions, like fertile land and a diverse climate, and you have a nation with immense resources. As the Human Development Report 2018 from the United Nations points out, India's sheer scale gives it a unique position in the global economy. And with the rising cost of doing business in China, due to higher wages and geopolitical tensions, India is increasingly seen as the ideal destination for low-cost manufacturing and services. Now, let's not sugarcoat things. India still faces significant challenges. Poverty remains a prevalent issue, with millions still living below the poverty line. Over half the population works in agriculture, which is less productive than modern industrial or service sectors. Infrastructure, while improving, lags behind that of developed nations. And as Drez and Sen argue in An Uncertain Glory, India and its contradictions, India's economic growth hasn't always translated into equitable social progress. Education, healthcare, and income inequality are ongoing concerns. But here's the exciting part. India is on the cusp of what could be the biggest and most rapid economic boom in history. The narrator of the video compares India today to China 15 years ago, just before its explosive growth. India has advantages China didn't have, like its English-speaking workforce and Western-style legal system. If India can capitalize on its manpower, resources, and business-friendly reforms, its economy could continue to double in size every few years. This wouldn't just make India a rival to China or the USA on the global stage, it would transform living conditions for hundreds of millions of its citizens. Let's put this in perspective with a quick comparison. In the early 2000s, China was the world's factory, churning out everything from toys to electronics. Today, as China's costs rise, companies are looking for the next big hub. India, with its lower wages, vast workforce, and improving infrastructure, is stepping into that role. Take the tech industry, for example. Cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad are global IT hubs, home to companies like Infosys and Tata Consultancy Services. These aren't just local success stories, they're global players, competing with Silicon Valley giants. Another example is India's pharmaceutical industry, often called the pharmacy of the world. India produces affordable generic drugs that supply not just its own population, but also developing nations across Africa and Asia. This industry thrives because of India's ability to combine low-cost production with a skilled English-speaking workforce. It's a perfect illustration of how India is leveraging its unique strengths to carve out a niche in the global economy. So what does India's rise mean for the world? First, it's a game changer for global trade. As India becomes a manufacturing and service hub, it could shift the balance of economic power. Companies that once relied on China may increasingly turn to India, diversifying global supply chains. This could reduce the world's dependence on a single manufacturing powerhouse, creating a more balanced global economy. Second, India's growth has profound implications for poverty reduction. The fact that India has already lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty is a testament to what economic growth can achieve. As India's economy continues to expand, it has the potential to improve education, healthcare, and infrastructure, creating a virtuous cycle of development. But this won't happen automatically. India's leaders will need to address inequality, invest in human capital, and ensure that growth benefits all segments of society. Third, India's rise could reshape geopolitics. As a democracy with a Western-style legal system, India is seen as a counterbalance to authoritarian powers like China. Its growing economic clout could give it more influence in international organizations like the United Nations or the World Trade Organization. And with its strategic location in South Asia, India is poised to play a bigger role in regional and global affairs. As we wrap up, let's reflect on India's incredible journey. From a colonial economy drained of its resources to a protectionist nation struggling with bureaucracy, India has transformed into a dynamic, fast-growing economy with the potential to become a global superpower. The 1991 reforms were a turning point, unleashing India's entrepreneurial spirit and opening its doors to the world. Today, India stands at a pivotal moment with the resources, population, and policies to drive unprecedented growth. But the road ahead isn't without challenges. Poverty, infrastructure, and inequality remain hurdles. Yet, with the right governance and continued reforms, India could not only rival the world's biggest economies, but also improve the lives of its 1.3 billion citizens. As the narrator of the video puts it, India is on the cusp of an unbelievable economic boom. And that's not just good news for India, it's good news for the world. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into India's economic story. If you've enjoyed this, please consider liking, subscribing, or joining our community to discuss these ideas further. India's journey is far from over, and I, for one, can't wait to see where it leads. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the world of economics. See you soon.